Hey there, history lovers. Today we're talking about the world's first empire. And no, it's not Rome, it's not Persia, it's not even Egypt. It's an empire so powerful it ruled from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And then vanished so completely that we can't even find its capital city. Like, literally. Archaeologists have been searching for over a century and it's just gone. Almost like the gods themselves hit the delete button. Spooky? Absolutely. But here's where it gets wild. Modern scientists might have finally cracked the case, and the answer involves ancient curses, climate catastrophe, and a king who thought it'd be a great idea to declare himself a living god. Spoiler alert, the actual gods were not impressed. We're diving into the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, a civilization that conquered 50 cities, invented the concept of empire itself, and then got absolutely wrecked by something their priests called divine punishment. For 4,000 years, that's been the official story. But what if the curse was something terrifyingly real? Something that could happen again? So smash that like button if you're ready for some ancient mystery with a side of existential dread, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I want to know which corners of the globe are tuning in for this one. Alright, let's get into it. Let's set the stage here, because when most people think of ancient empires, their minds immediately jump to the greatest hits: Rome with its legions and aqueducts, Persia with its royal road and immortal warriors, maybe Egypt with its pyramids and that whole obsession with mummifying literally everything, including cats. And look, those are all fantastic civilizations, absolutely legendary stuff. But here's the thing that might blow your mind a little bit. None of them were first, not even close. The title of World's First Empire belongs to a civilization that most people have never even heard of, and honestly, that's kind of insane when you think about it. We're talking about the Akkadian Empire, a powerhouse that dominated the ancient Near East more than 4,000 years ago, long before Rome was even a collection of mud huts on some hills by the Tiber River. The Akkadians were running a sophisticated imperial administration, while most of Europe was still figuring out how bronze worked. And yet, ask the average person on the street about the Akkadians, and you'll probably get a blank stare followed by, "Is that a new sushi restaurant?" The Akkadian Empire emerged in Mesopotamia, that famous stretch of land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that historians love to call the cradle of civilization. And they're not exaggerating. This region gave humanity some of its most important inventions: writing, the wheel, mathematics, astronomy, and the concept of cities themselves. But for thousands of years, Mesopotamia was a chaotic patchwork of independent city-states, each with its own king, its own patron deity, and its own ideas about how the world should work. Cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Kish were constantly at each other's throats, forming alliances, breaking alliances, and generally treating the whole region like one giant game of chess, where the pieces occasionally set each other on fire. There was no unity, no central authority, no concept of a larger political entity that could bring all these squabbling cities under one banner. That is, until one man decided that he was going to change the entire course of human history. That man was Sargon of Akkad, and his story is so wild that if you pitched it to a Hollywood producer today, they'd probably tell you to tone it down because it sounds too unrealistic. According to the legends that surrounded him, and these legends were already being told for thousands of years in the ancient world, Sargon's origin story reads like something straight out of mythology. His mother, a high priestess who apparently wasn't supposed to be having children in the first place, gave birth to him in secret. Unable to keep the baby and presumably facing some serious consequences if anyone found out, she placed the infant in a basket sealed with bitumen, which is basically ancient waterproof tar, and set him adrift on the Euphrates River. Sound familiar? If you're thinking, wait, isn't that the Moses story? You're absolutely right to notice the similarity. Except here's the kicker. Sargon's legend predates Moses by at least 1,000 years, maybe more. So either babies floating down rivers in baskets was a surprisingly common occurrence in the ancient Near East, or someone was doing some serious narrative borrowing later on. Either way, the legend says that a humble gardener named Aki discovered the basket, pulled it from the river, and raised the child as his own. Now you might think that being raised by a gardener would set you up for a nice peaceful life of tending plants and staying out of trouble. And you would be completely wrong, because Sargon apparently had different plans. Through circumstances that the ancient texts are frustratingly vague about, the young man somehow ended up working as a cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, the king of Kish. Being a cupbearer might sound like a glorified waiter position, but in the ancient world this was actually a role of enormous trust and importance. The cupbearer was responsible for tasting the king's wine before serving it, which meant the king was literally putting his life in this person's hands every single day. One wrong sip, one missed poison, and suddenly you're looking for a new monarch. It was a position that required absolute loyalty, discretion, and access to the innermost circles of power. For a mysterious foundling with unknown parentage, landing this job was already remarkable. But Sargon wasn't satisfied with just surviving in the shadows of power. He wanted to sit on the throne himself. The details of how exactly Sargon went from trusted servant to conqueror are lost to time, which is incredibly frustrating for historians who would love to know the specifics of his coup. What we do know is that at some point things between Sargon and King Ozobaba went very, very wrong. Some legends suggest that the king began having prophetic dreams warning him that his cupbearer would overthrow him, which honestly seems like the kind of red flag you should probably act on immediately. Other accounts hint at political conspiracies and power struggles within the court. Whatever the exact trigger was, the end result was that Sargon rebelled against his master, seized control of Kish, and then apparently decided that one city just wasn't enough to satisfy his ambitions. He founded a brand new capital city called Akkad, or Agade in some translations, and from this base he launched a military campaign unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. What followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Sargon and his armies swept across Mesopotamia like a force of nature, conquering city after city in what must have seemed like an unstoppable tide of military genius. The ancient texts boast that he conquered no fewer than 50 cities, uniting the entire region from the upper reaches of the Euphrates all the way down to the Persian Gulf under a single political authority for the first time in history. But he didn't stop there. His campaigns pushed westward toward the Mediterranean Sea, northward into the mountains of Anatolia, and eastward toward the territories that would later become Persia. Trade routes that had operated independently for centuries suddenly found themselves under Akkadian control. Silver flowed in from Anatolia, lapis lazuli arrived from distant Afghanistan, cedarwood came from the mountains of Lebanon, all of it funneling back to the new imperial centre at Akkad. For the first time, a single ruler controlled the economic arteries of the entire known world. And Sargon wasn't just a military conqueror, he was also a political innovator who essentially invented the concept of imperial administration. Previous rulers in Mesopotamia had been content to dominate their own cities and maybe extract tribute from neighbours when they felt particularly powerful. Sargon took a completely different approach. He installed loyal governors in conquered cities, often replacing local rulers entirely with men who owed their positions directly to him. He standardized weights and measures across his realm, making trade and taxation far more efficient. He promoted the Akkadian language as a unifying force, spreading it throughout the empire until it became the lingua franca of the entire Near East, a status it would maintain for nearly 2,000 years after his death. In many ways, Sargon created the template that every subsequent empire would follow, from the Assyrians to the Persians to the Romans. He wasn't just building a kingdom, he was inventing the very concept of empire itself. The scale of Sargon's achievement is genuinely difficult to overstate. This was happening around 2334 BCE, give or take a few decades depending on which chronology you prefer. To put that in perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already standing when Sargon began his conquests. It had been built roughly 2 centuries earlier. But while Egypt was a single unified state centered on the Nile, Mesopotamia had never seen anything like this kind of political unification. Sargon ruled for approximately 56 years, which is an absolutely remarkable reign length for any era of history, let alone one where the average life expectancy was probably somewhere in the mid-30s, and political assassination was basically a spectator sport. By the time of his death, he had transformed a fragmented landscape of competing city-states into a cohesive empire that stretched across multiple ecological zones, linguistic groups, and cultural traditions. Not bad for a guy who started life floating down a river in a waterproofed basket. But here's where things start to get interesting. And by interesting, I mean ominous. The ancient texts that celebrate Sargon's conquests also contain hints of something darker lurking beneath the surface. Several clay tablets describe rebellions that erupted throughout his reign, suggesting that not everyone was thrilled about being incorporated into this new imperial order. One famous inscription describes how Sargon faced a massive coordinated uprising late in his reign, when all the lands he had conquered simultaneously revolted against him. The old king, now probably in his 70s or 80s, somehow managed to crush this rebellion and restore order, but the very fact that it happened suggests serious underlying tensions. More troubling still are the religious dimensions of Sargon's story. The Mesopotamians took their gods extremely seriously, and the cosmic order was not something to be trifled with. By conquering the sacred cities of Sumer, by placing his own people in charge of ancient temples, by elevating Akkadian culture above the traditions of centuries, Sargon was doing more than just building an empire. According to some ancient interpreters, he was challenging the divine order itself. The Mesopotamian worldview held that the gods had established the proper arrangement of the cosmos, including the political relationships between cities and the status of their temples. When Sargon marched his armies into the sacred city of Nippur, home of Enlil, the king of the gods, he wasn't just making a military move, he was making a theological statement. When he appointed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon, god Nanna at Ur, he was inserting his own bloodline into the religious hierarchy in a way that had never been done before. These actions, while politically savvy, carried profound spiritual risks in the eyes of contemporaries. The gods of Mesopotamia were not distant abstract forces, they were active participants in human affairs, capable of blessing those who pleased them and destroying those who angered them. And some ancient writers would later argue that Sargon, for all his brilliance, had planted the seeds of divine retribution that would eventually bloom into catastrophe. Sargon died around 2279 BCE, having accomplished more than perhaps any ruler before him. He had started with nothing, less than nothing really, if you count the whole abandoned baby floating in a river thing, and had ended up controlling the largest and most powerful state the world had ever seen. But empires, as we all know, tend to have a limited shelf life. The sons and grandsons who inherited Sargon's creation would face challenges that even his legendary abilities might not have overcome. Internal rebellions, external invasions, and, if you believe the ancient texts, the growing anger of the gods themselves were all waiting in the wings. The Akkadian Empire would endure for approximately 150 years after Sargon's death, a respectable run by ancient standards. But its end, when it came, would be so sudden, so complete, and so mysterious that it would haunt the collective memory of Mesopotamia for millennia to come. The cities would fall silent, the irrigation canals would fill with sand, and the glorious capital of Akkad itself would vanish so thoroughly that to this day, despite over a century of archaeological searching, no one has ever found it. How does an entire empire simply disappear? How does a capital city, once the most magnificent metropolis on Earth, get erased from the map so completely that we can't even locate its ruins? These are the questions that have puzzled historians, archaeologists, and scientists for generations. The ancient Mesopotamians had their own answer, of course. They said it was a curse, divine punishment for the hubris of kings who thought they could challenge the gods. Modern researchers have proposed more scientific explanations involving climate change, volcanic eruptions, and environmental collapse. But as we'll see, the truth might be even stranger than either explanation alone. Sometimes the line between myth and reality gets blurry, especially when we're dealing with events that happened more than 4,000 years ago. And sometimes the superstitions of ancient peoples turn out to contain kernels of genuine insight that our modern instruments are only now beginning to confirm. The fall of the Akkadian Empire is one of history's great mysteries, a puzzle that involves everything from cuneiform tablets to ice cores from Greenland, and we're just getting started. So we've established that Sargon built the world's first empire, conquered everybody who was anybody in the ancient Near East, and generally rewrote the rules of what political power could look like. But every great empire needs a great capital, a physical manifestation of its glory that screams, "We're in charge here," to everyone who sees it. For Sargon, that city was Akkad, and according to every ancient source we have, it was absolutely spectacular. We're talking about a metropolis that made other cities look like provincial backwaters, a place where wealth and power concentrated to a degree that the ancient world had simply never witnessed before. Merchants from dozens of different cultures crowded its streets. Diplomats from distant kingdoms waited in its courtyards. Treasures from the farthest corners of the known world filled its warehouses and temples. Agade was, by all accounts, the New York City of the Bronze Age, except with more ziggurats and fewer pizza places. The ancient texts describe Agade in terms that border on the ecstatic. Its harbour was perpetually filled with ships bringing exotic goods from across the seas. Its granaries were so enormous and so well stocked that famine seemed like a concept from another world entirely. The royal palace was a complex of unprecedented magnificence, with courtyards paved in precious materials and throne rooms designed to intimidate visiting dignitaries into immediate submission. Temples to the great gods rose toward the heavens, their facades decorated with precious metals and semi-precious stones that must have glittered almost blindingly in the Mesopotamian sun. The streets were wide enough for grand processions, and the markets offered literally everything that money could buy in the ancient world. If you had told a resident of Agade that their city would one day be completely forgotten, they probably would have laughed in your face before having you thrown out for obvious insanity. And the trade networks that fed into Agade were genuinely mind-boggling for their time. Silver arrived in enormous quantities from the mines of Anatolia, where it was extracted through processes that we would definitely consider horrific by modern standards, but were state-of-the-art for the Bronze Age. Lapis lazuli, that gorgeous deep blue stone that ancient peoples valued almost as highly as gold, travelled all the way from the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, a journey of thousands of kilometres through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Cedarwood came from the forests of Lebanon, prized for its durability and its fragrance, perfect for constructing temples and palaces that were meant to last for eternity. Copper, tin, gold, exotic textiles, rare spices, precious resins, all of it flowed into Agade like rivers converging on a single massive lake. The Akkadian capital had become the gravitational centre of Bronze Age commerce, the place where all roads ultimately led, the hub of a trading network that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean coast. But here's where things get weird. Actually, not just weird, completely baffling. Despite being one of the most important cities in ancient history, despite being described in loving detail by countless texts, despite being the capital of an empire that dominated the Near East for over a century, Agade has never been found. Let that sink in for a moment. Archaeologists have been systematically excavating Mesopotamia for well over 100 years. They've found cities that were abandoned 5,000 years ago. They've discovered settlements that were minor villages in their prime. They've unearthed the ruins of places that were barely mentioned in any ancient text. But Agade, the crown jewel of the world's first empire, the city that ancient writers couldn't stop talking about? Nothing. Nada. Zero. It's as if the city just vanished. Now, you might think that finding an ancient city shouldn't be that hard. These places had massive buildings, extensive walls, deep foundations, the kind of structures that leave traces in the archaeological record for millennia. And normally you'd be right. The ruins of Babylon are still visible. Has been extensively excavated. Nineveh's remains were discovered in the 19th century. But Agade has somehow managed to evade every systematic search, every survey, every archaeological expedition that has gone looking for it. Researchers have proposed dozens of possible locations, examined countless satellite images, dug test trenches in promising spots, and come up empty every single time. It's become one of the great frustrations of Mesopotamian archaeology. This city that should be obvious, that should be impossible to miss, that keeps refusing to reveal itself. There are several theories about why Agade remains so stubbornly hidden. One possibility is that the city was built primarily of mud brick, like most Mesopotamian settlements, and that subsequent civilizations cannibalized its ruins for building materials so thoroughly that nothing recognizable remains. This happened fairly often in the ancient world. Why go through the trouble of making new bricks when there's a perfectly good abandoned city right there with millions of them already fired and ready to use? Another theory suggests that the Tigris or Euphrates might have shifted course over the millennia, either burying Agade under meters of river sediment or washing away its remains entirely. Rivers in Mesopotamia were notoriously fickle, and cities that were once riverside metropolises have been found kilometers away from any current water source. But the most haunting theory, the one that the ancient Mesopotamians themselves would have appreciated, is that Agade was so thoroughly cursed that the gods themselves ensured it would never be found. The city that defied heaven was erased from the earth so completely that even its bones would never be recovered. Speaking of curses and divine displeasure, let's talk about what the ancient sources say was happening in the years leading up to the empire's collapse, because it reads like a horror movie script written by particularly dramatic priests. The Mesopotamians were absolutely obsessed with omens. They believed that the gods communicated with humanity through signs embedded in the natural world, and they developed elaborate systems for reading and interpreting these divine messages. There were omens in the movements of stars and planets. There were omens in the shapes of animal livers. They had entire schools dedicated to hepatoscopy, which is exactly what it sounds like. Trained specialists who would sacrifice an animal and then examine its liver for abnormalities that might indicate the gods' will. There were omens in the behaviour of birds, in the patterns of oil on water, in the way smoke rose from sacrificial fires, in unusual births, in strange weather, in practically everything you could imagine. For the Mesopotamians, the universe was constantly talking to them, and their job was to listen. And in the decades before the Akkadian Empire's fall, the signs were apparently screaming. The cuneiform tablets from this period describe an escalating series of portents that would have sent ancient priests into absolute panic mode. Solar eclipses occurred at times considered deeply inauspicious, and if you think modern people get weird about eclipses, you have no idea how seriously the ancients took these events. An eclipse meant that the sun god Shamash was being attacked, that the cosmic order was under threat, that terrible things were about to happen unless immediate ritual action was taken. Kings would sometimes go into hiding during eclipses, with substitute monarchs placed on the throne to absorb any divine wrath that might be incoming. The fact that multiple eclipses seemed to coincide with the empire's decline would have been interpreted as undeniable proof that the gods were withdrawing their favour. But the eclipses were just the beginning. Ancient texts describe strange lights in the sky, meteors perhaps, or unusual atmospheric phenomena that were seen as divine messengers carrying warnings of impending doom. There were reports of sacred animals behaving erratically, of temple rituals going wrong in ways that couldn't be explained, of divination after divination, returning the same ominous results, no matter how many times the priest repeated their procedures. One particularly unsettling account describes voices being heard emanating from temple sanctuaries when no human was present, the gods themselves apparently so agitated that they couldn't keep silent about the catastrophe they were preparing to unleash. Whether you interpret these accounts as genuine supernatural occurrences, as natural phenomena misunderstood through a religious lens, or as later literary inventions designed to explain the empire's fall in theological terms, they paint a picture of a society that was becoming increasingly convinced that something terrible was coming. The priests and diviners of Mesopotamia weren't stupid, despite what our modern secular perspective might assume. They were highly trained specialists who had inherited centuries of observational data, and their job required them to pay extremely close attention to the world around them. When they recorded unusual weather patterns, they were documenting real meteorological events, even if their interpretation of those events involved angry deities rather than climate systems. When they noted that harvests were failing or that rivers were running lower than usual, they were making accurate observations about environmental conditions, even if they attributed those conditions to divine punishment rather than drought cycles. In other words, the omens that filled ancient tablets might actually contain genuine scientific information about what was happening to the Akkadian world in its final decades, information that was encoded in religious language but is now being decoded by modern researchers using very different methods. And what those modern researchers are finding is pretty extraordinary. The ancient priests may have been right that something catastrophic was coming. They just had the mechanism wrong. It wasn't angry gods preparing to smite humanity for its arrogance. It was something arguably even more terrifying. The climate itself was beginning to shift in ways that would make the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia increasingly hostile to human civilization. The voices from the temples weren't divine warnings. They were perhaps the echoes of a world beginning to crack under pressures that no amount of ritual could address. The strange lights in the sky might have been volcanic ash catching the light of sunset, the visible signatures of eruptions thousands of kilometers away that were already setting in motion the atmospheric changes that would doom the empire. The failing harvests and strange animal behaviours might have been the first tremors of an environmental earthquake that was about to bring the entire Akkadian world crashing down. But of course, the people living through these events had no way of understanding any of this. All they knew was that the gods seemed angry, that the signs were uniformly terrible, and that despite all their prayers and sacrifices and rituals, things kept getting worse. The empire that had seemed invincible just a generation earlier was beginning to show cracks. Rebellions that would once have been crushed immediately were becoming harder to suppress. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for decades were becoming disrupted. And in the provinces, particularly in the northern regions where rainfall was crucial for agriculture, something was going very, very wrong with the crops. The granaries that had always overflowed were starting to run low. The markets that had offered everything were starting to show gaps on their shelves. The magnificent city of Akkad, jewel of the ancient world, was about to discover just how quickly magnificence can turn to dust when the rain stopped falling. The Mesopotamian concept of divine favour was deeply tied to practical outcomes. If your city was prosperous, if your harvest were good, if your armies were victorious, then obviously the gods were pleased with you. But the reverse was equally true. If things started going wrong, it meant that divine favour had been withdrawn, and the only question was why. What had been done to anger the gods so severely? For the Akkadian Empire, the answer that later generations would settle on was both simple and devastating. The kings of Akkad had gone too far. They had conquered too much, disrupted too many sacred traditions, and ultimately committed acts of sacrilege so severe that the gods had no choice but to respond with total annihilation. Whether this theological explanation had any basis in actual historical events, or whether it was simply a convenient way for later Mesopotamians to make sense of an otherwise incomprehensible catastrophe, is a question we'll be exploring in the next section. Because the story of how the Akkadian Empire finally fell involves a king who did something so outrageous, so unprecedented, so cosmically arrogant, that even 4,000 years later it still makes you do a double take. His name was Naram Sin, and he decided that being the most powerful ruler on earth wasn't enough. He wanted to be a god. Naram Sin was the grandson of Sargon the Great, which meant he had some absolutely massive sandals to fill. His grandfather had literally invented the concept of empire, conquered the known world and become a legend while still alive. His father Manishtushu had maintained the empire through a combination of military campaigns and brutal suppression of rebellions. By the time Naram Sin took the throne around 2254 BCE, the Akkadian Empire was already the most powerful political entity on the planet, stretching across territories that encompassed dozens of different peoples, languages, and cultures. Most rulers in this position would have been content to simply maintain what their ancestors had built, to keep the machine running smoothly, to enjoy the fruits of imperial power without taking unnecessary risks. But Naram Sin apparently looked at everything his family had accomplished and thought to himself, "You know what this empire needs? More me." To be fair, the guy had some legitimate reasons for confidence. His military campaigns were genuinely impressive, even by the already high standards of Akkadian warfare. He crushed a massive coordinated rebellion early in his reign, the kind of multi-front uprising that had nearly destroyed his grandfather, with such efficiency that it became legendary. He pushed the empire's boundaries even further than Sargon had, launching expeditions into mountainous regions that previous rulers had considered unconquerable. He defeated enemies that the Akkadians had been struggling against for generations. Ancient inscriptions describe him winning 37 battles in a single year, which is either an incredible feat of military genius or some extremely generous accounting by his court scribes. Either way, Naram Sin was clearly a formidable ruler who expanded Akkadian power to its absolute zenith. Under his reign, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent, and its influence stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the Iranian plateau. And then he did something that no Mesopotamian king had ever done before, something so audacious, so unprecedented, so cosmically arrogant that it would echo through the region's religious consciousness for millennia. Naram Sin declared himself a living god. Now, to understand why this was such a big deal, you need to understand how Mesopotamian religion and kingship worked. In this worldview, kings were definitely special. They were chosen by the gods, they served as intermediaries between heaven and earth, they held sacred responsibilities that ordinary mortals could never fulfill. But they were still, at the end of the day, human. They were servants of the gods, not equals. They derived their authority from divine favour, which could be granted or withdrawn based on their behaviour. The actual gods, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Shamash, and the rest of the Mesopotamian pantheon, were immortal beings of unimaginable power who had created the universe and continued to run it according to their inscrutable will. For a human king to claim divine status wasn't just arrogant, it was a fundamental violation of the cosmic order. It was like an employee showing up to work one day and declaring himself the CEO, the board of directors, and the entire corporate structure all at once. But Naram-Sin went ahead and did it anyway. He added the divine determinative, a special cuneiform sign used to indicate gods and goddesses, before his name in official inscriptions. He had himself depicted wearing the horned crown that was exclusively reserved for deities. He established cults devoted to his worship in cities throughout the empire, and most famously, he commissioned the stunning Victory Stele that still survives today, one of the most remarkable pieces of ancient art ever discovered. This limestone monument shows Naram-Sin ascending a mountain, his body towering over his enemies and even his own soldiers, his head reaching toward heavenly symbols that shine down upon him alone. He wears the divine horned crown, carries weapons that the gods themselves might wield, and stands in a pose of absolute triumphant dominance. The message is impossible to miss. This is not merely a king, this is a god walking among mortals, crushing all opposition beneath his divine feet. The audacity of it is genuinely breathtaking, even from our modern perspective 4,000 years later. Imagine if a political leader today suddenly announced that they were not just the head of state, but an actual deity deserving of religious worship. The reaction would be, well, let's just say the term constitutional crisis wouldn't quite cover it. But in ancient Mesopotamia, where the gods weren't abstract philosophical concepts but active, present forces who could destroy cities and end dynasties on a whim, declaring yourself one of them was playing with fire on a cosmic scale. You were essentially challenging the established divine order and betting your entire civilization that the real gods wouldn't mind. As it turns out, according to the ancient texts, they minded quite a lot. The Curse of Akkad is one of the most remarkable literary compositions to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, and it tells the story of what happened when the gods decided to respond to Naram-Sin's hubris. Now, it's important to note up front that this text was written centuries after the events it describes, probably during the Third Dynasty of Ur, when Mesopotamian scholars were trying to make sense of the Akkadian Empire's dramatic collapse. So we're not dealing with an eyewitness account here. We're dealing with a theological interpretation of historical events, a story designed to explain why a seemingly invincible empire had crumbled so completely. But even acknowledging its later composition, the Curse of Akkad provides invaluable insights into how ancient Mesopotamians understood their own history and the cosmic forces they believed shaped it. According to this text, things started going wrong when Naram-Sin received unfavourable omens from the gods. The divine messages were clear. The gods were not pleased with the direction things were heading. A sensible king would have responded with humility, with increased sacrifices and prayers, with desperate attempts to regain divine favour through pious behaviour. But Naram-Sin, drunk on his own power and convinced of his own divinity, responded differently. He challenged the omens. He basically told the gods that he didn't care what they thought. And then, in an act of breathtaking sacrilege, he marched his army to Nippur and attacked the Akur, the temple of Enlil, king of the gods, the most sacred site in all of Mesopotamia. The text describes what happened next in vivid, horrifying detail. Naram-Sin's soldiers smashed their way into the temple complex, destroying shrines that had stood for centuries. They plundered the sacred treasury, carrying away precious metals and holy objects. They desecrated the inner sanctums where only the highest priests had ever been permitted to tread. The temple that had been the spiritual heart of Sumerian civilization, the place where heaven and earth were believed to meet, was ransacked by the very empire that should have been its protector. It was, in religious terms, the ultimate betrayal, a king who had been chosen by the gods turning against them in the most violent and disrespectful way imaginable. Enlil's response, according to the Curse of Akkad, was swift and terrible. The king of the gods summoned the Gutians, a mountain people from the Zagros range whom the Mesopotamians considered to be barely human, and unleashed them upon the empire like a divine weapon of mass destruction. The text describes the Gutians in terms that are clearly exaggerated for dramatic effect, but convey the horror they inspired. They were people who know no inhibitions, with human instincts but canine intelligence and with monkey features. They covered the earth like locusts and brought chaos wherever they went. But the Gutians were just one part of Enlil's punishment. The god also cursed the land itself, withholding the rains that Mesopotamian agriculture depended upon, causing the rivers to run low, turning fertile fields into dusty wastelands. Famines spread across the empire as granaries emptied and crops failed year after year. The text then describes the collapse of civilization in increasingly apocalyptic terms. Cities that had been centres of culture and commerce became ghost towns. Trade routes that had connected distant regions fell silent. The carefully maintained irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible fell into disrepair and eventually ceased to function at all. People who had known prosperity for generations found themselves reduced to desperate survival, willing to do anything for a handful of grain. The text even includes haunting details about the breakdown of social order, how the bonds that held communities together dissolved under the pressure of starvation, how people turned on each other in ways that would have been unthinkable just years before. And the curse had one final devastating component. Akkad itself, the glorious capital that had been the envy of the ancient world, was condemned to eternal desolation. Enlil declared that the city would never be rebuilt, that its ruins would become a place of horror avoided by all living things, that even the spirits of the dead would shun its accursed ground. The text describes Akkad's fall with a kind of savage poetry. Where merchant ships had once crowded the harbours, now there was only silence. Where the markets had overflowed with goods from distant lands, now there was only dust and emptiness. Where the temples had echoed with hymns of praise, now only the wind howled through broken walls. The greatest city on earth had been erased, and the text insists that this was exactly what it deserved. Now here's where things get really interesting for modern researchers. For a long time, scholars treated the Curse of Akkad as pure religious propaganda, a mythological tale designed to teach theological lessons about the importance of respecting the gods and their temples. The idea that it might contain genuine historical information was dismissed because, well, divine curses and barbarian invasions summoned by angry gods don't exactly fit our scientific worldview. But as archaeologists and climate scientists have begun to piece together what actually happened at the end of the Akkadian Empire, they've discovered something remarkable. The Curse of Akkad might be more accurate than anyone expected. Not the part about Enlil personally calling down destruction, obviously, but the environmental catastrophe it describes, the drought, the agricultural collapse, the abandonment of cities, the invasion by desperate peoples from the margins, all of that actually happened. The ancient poets who composed this text were describing real events. They just attributed those events to supernatural causes rather than climate change. The question of whether Naram-Sin actually desecrated the temple at Nippur remains historically uncertain. Archaeological evidence from the site is ambiguous, and some scholars argue that the story was invented by later writers who needed a theological explanation for the empire's fall. Others point out that the Akkadian kings did interfere with traditional Sumerian religious institutions in ways that would have caused genuine resentment, and that a major conflict between royal and priestly authority is historically plausible. We may never know for certain what really happened between Naram-Sin and the Temple of Enlil, but what we do know is that something catastrophic struck the Akkadian Empire in the decades after Naram-Sin's reign, something that the ancient Mesopotamians could only understand as divine punishment for unforgivable sins. The psychological impact of the empire's fall on subsequent Mesopotamian civilization cannot be overstated. For centuries afterward, the story of Akkad and its destruction was told and retold as a warning about the dangers of hubris. Kings who came later went out of their way to demonstrate their piety and humility, to present themselves as servants of the gods rather than their equals. The memory of Naram-Sin, once celebrated as the greatest conqueror of his age, became a cautionary tale about the limits of human power. You can almost imagine Mesopotamian parents telling their children, "See what happens when you think you're too good to listen to the gods? That's how you end up like Naram-Sin, your empire in ruins, your capital city vanished from the earth, your name cursed for eternity." It was the ultimate ancient morality tale, and it shaped religious and political thought in the region for millennia. But here's the twist that makes this story so fascinating from a modern perspective. What if the curse was real, just not in the way the ancients understood it? What if the gods didn't need to intervene because nature itself was about to deliver a punishment more devastating than anything divine wrath could conjure? In the next sections, we're going to look at what modern science has discovered about what really killed the Akkadian Empire, and trust me, the truth is stranger, more terrifying, and more relevant to our own world than any ancient curse could ever be. So we've got an ancient empire that collapsed under what its people believed was a divine curse. We've got a king who declared himself a god and may or may not have desecrated the most sacred temple in Mesopotamia. We've got a capital city that vanished so completely that modern archaeologists can't even find its ruins. And we've got ancient texts describing drought, famine, and societal collapse on a scale that transformed the entire region. For thousands of years, this was simply accepted as a theological story. The gods punished human arrogance, end of story, don't be like Naram Sin. But in the late 20th century, a new group of investigators entered the picture, armed not with cuneiform tablets and religious interpretations, but with sediment cores, mass spectrometers, and a very different way of reading the past. Welcome to the world of paleoclimatology, where scientists piece together ancient weather patterns from clues that would make Sherlock Holmes jealous. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected place, the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Now, you might not think of ocean mud as particularly exciting reading material, and honestly, you'd be right for most purposes. But for climate scientists, seafloor sediments are basically time capsules that record environmental conditions going back thousands of years. Here's how it works. Rivers carry sediment from the land into the sea, and that sediment settles on the ocean floor in layers, year after year, century after century. By drilling down through these layers and analysing their composition, researchers can reconstruct what conditions were like on land when each layer was deposited. More sediment from rivers generally means more rainfall. Less sediment means drier conditions. Changes in the types of microscopic organisms preserved in the mud can indicate shifts in water temperature and salinity. It's like reading a very, very slow diary written by the Earth itself. In the 1990s and early 2000s, teams of researchers began examining sediment cores from the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman with a specific question in mind. Was there any physical evidence for the climate catastrophe described in ancient Mesopotamian texts? And what they found was frankly stunning. Around 2200 BCE, give or take a few decades, which is actually pretty precise when you're dealing with events from 4,000 years ago, there was a dramatic shift in the sediment record. The amount of material being deposited by rivers dropped sharply, indicating that those rivers were carrying much less water than before. Chemical analysis of the sediments showed increased concentrations of minerals associated with dry, dusty conditions. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Something major had changed in the regional climate right around the time the Akkadian Empire fell. But the Persian Gulf sediments were just the beginning. The real smoking gun came from caves in Oman, and this is where the science gets genuinely cool. Stalagmites, those spiky rock formations that grow upward from cave floors, are formed when mineral-rich water drips from the ceiling and slowly deposits layer upon layer of calcite over time. And here's the beautiful thing. The chemical composition of each layer reflects the conditions when it was deposited. Specifically, the ratio of different oxygen isotopes in the calcite varies depending on how much rainfall was occurring at the time. More rain means more of one isotope, less rain means more of another. By drilling into stalagmites and analysing these isotopic ratios at different depths, scientists can reconstruct precipitation patterns going back thousands of years with remarkable precision. A team of researchers led by geologist Heidi Cullen examined stalagmites from Hoti Cave in Oman, and their findings were nothing short of extraordinary. The isotope record showed that around 2200 BCE, the region experienced a sudden, dramatic drop in rainfall, not a gradual decline, but a rapid shift to much drier conditions that persisted for approximately 300 years. Let me repeat that, because it's important. 300 years of severe drought. We're not talking about a bad decade or even a bad century. We're talking about multiple generations of people being born, living and dying under conditions of perpetual water scarcity. To put that in perspective, 300 years ago from today, the United States didn't exist yet, and the Industrial Revolution was still decades away. Imagine if everything since then had been one continuous drought. That's what the people of the ancient Near East were facing. The implications of this discovery were enormous. For the first time, there was hard scientific evidence that the environmental catastrophe described in texts like the Curse of Agade wasn't mythological exaggeration, it was real. The divine punishment that had supposedly been unleashed upon the Akkadian Empire was actually a massive prolonged climate event that would have devastated any agricultural civilization in its path. The rivers that Mesopotamian farmers depended on for irrigation would have dropped to levels that made traditional farming impossible. The carefully engineered canal systems that had transformed the desert into productive farmland would have become increasingly difficult to maintain as water supplies dwindled. Crop yields would have plummeted, food stores would have been depleted, and the surplus agricultural production that supported cities, trade, armies, and all the other infrastructure of imperial power would have simply evaporated. And the evidence kept piling up from multiple independent sources. Marine cores from the Gulf of Oman confirmed the drought signal. Lake sediments from across the region showed the same pattern. Pollen records indicated a dramatic shift in vegetation, with species adapted to wetter conditions being replaced by those that could survive with less water. Archaeological surveys found that numerous settlements in northern Mesopotamia were abandoned right around this time, with layers of wind-blown sand and dust covering the ruins, exactly what you'd expect if the land had suddenly become too dry to support agriculture. Every new piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Around 2200 BCE, the Near East experienced one of the most severe and prolonged droughts in its entire history. Scientists now call this event the 4.2 kiloyear event because it occurred approximately 4,200 years before the present. And here's what makes it even more significant. It wasn't just a local phenomenon. Climate records from across the globe show evidence of major disruptions around the same time. Egypt experienced a catastrophic drought that contributed to the collapse of the Old Kingdom. The same civilization that had built the pyramids found itself facing famine, civil war, and the breakdown of central authority. The Indus Valley civilization, which had flourished for centuries in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, went into decline and eventually collapsed. Early Bronze Age cultures across the Mediterranean and the Aegean experienced widespread disruption. Whatever caused the 4.2 kiloyear event, it wasn't targeting the Akkadian Empire specifically. It was a global phenomenon that reshaped human civilization across multiple continents. The mechanism behind this climate shift is still being debated, but the leading theories involve changes in atmospheric circulation patterns that disrupted the monsoon systems delivering moisture to the region. The summer monsoons that normally brought rain to the Arabian Peninsula and surrounding areas apparently weakened dramatically, leaving the entire region parched. Some researchers have suggested that changes in North Atlantic Ocean circulation might have triggered a cascade of atmospheric effects that propagated across Eurasia. Others have pointed to possible connections with volcanic activity or solar variations. We'll explore some of these theories in more detail shortly, because the story of what actually caused the drought is almost as fascinating as the drought itself. But for now, let's focus on what this means for our understanding of the Akkadian Empire's fall. The ancient Mesopotamians looked at the catastrophe engulfing their world and saw divine punishment for human sins. They created elaborate theological explanations involving angry gods, desecrated temples, and cosmic retribution. And honestly, given the information available to them, this interpretation made perfect sense. They had no way of knowing about global climate systems, atmospheric circulation patterns, or isotope ratios in cave formations. What they did know was that the rains had stopped, the crops were dying, and their civilization was collapsing around them. In the absence of scientific explanations, religious ones filled the void, and those religious explanations shaped Mesopotamian culture and politics for millennia afterward. But here's the really profound part. The ancient storytellers weren't wrong about what happened. They were just wrong about why. When the Curse of Akkad describes fields turning to dust, cities being abandoned, and people dying of starvation, it's describing real events that actually occurred. The text is essentially an eyewitness account of climate-driven civilizational collapse, filtered through a religious worldview that attributed everything to divine agency. Strip away the theological framing, and you're left with a remarkably accurate description of what happens when a sophisticated agricultural society suddenly loses access to the water that makes its existence possible. The ancient poets were better historians than we gave them credit for. They preserved a record of catastrophe that modern science is only now learning to read properly. This realization has profound implications for how we think about ancient texts in general. For a long time, historians tended to dismiss mythological and religious literature as pure fantasy, interesting for what it revealed about ancient beliefs, but useless as a source of factual information. The discovery that the Curse of Akkad contains genuine historical and environmental data has helped change that attitude. Now, researchers approach ancient texts with a more nuanced perspective, looking for kernels of real events embedded within religious and mythological frameworks. The floods described in Mesopotamian literature might reflect actual catastrophic flooding events. The plagues and famines mentioned in Egyptian texts might correspond to real outbreaks and climate shifts. The divine punishments visited upon ancient kingdoms might be folk memories of natural disasters that overwhelmed the societies of their time. The case of the Akkadian Empire also raises uncomfortable questions about our own civilization's vulnerability to climate change. Here was the most powerful, most sophisticated, most technologically advanced society of its age, and it was brought down by a shift in rainfall patterns that lasted a few centuries. The Akkadians had irrigation systems, grain storage facilities, administrative bureaucracies designed to manage resources efficiently, and military forces that could project power across vast distances. None of it was enough. When the climate changed faster than their society could adapt, everything they had built crumbled. And while our modern civilization is infinitely more technologically capable than anything the ancient world could have imagined, we're also far more dependent on complex interconnected systems that could be disrupted by environmental changes we're only beginning to understand. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The climate evidence explains a lot about what happened to the Akkadian Empire, but it doesn't explain everything. There's still the question of what actually caused the drought in the first place, and as we'll see in the next section, one of the most intriguing theories involves a catastrophic event that occurred thousands of kilometers away from Mesopotamia. Sometimes the butterflies that cause hurricanes aren't metaphorical at all. Sometimes they're volcanoes. So we know there was a massive, prolonged drought that struck the ancient Near East around 2200 BCE. We know it lasted approximately 300 years and devastated agricultural civilizations across multiple continents. We know that the Akkadian Empire was among its victims, along with the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the Indus Valley Civilization, and numerous other cultures that had flourished for centuries. But knowing that something happened is very different from understanding why it happened. Climate doesn't just randomly decide to stop delivering rain for 3 centuries. Something triggered this catastrophic shift in atmospheric patterns, and scientists have been hunting for the culprit ever since the drought was confirmed. One of the most compelling theories points to a suspect that seems almost absurdly distant from Mesopotamia: a massive volcanic eruption, possibly on the other side of the world, that sent shockwaves through the global climate system and accidentally murdered one of history's greatest empires. Now, if you're thinking, wait, how can a volcano thousands of kilometers away cause a drought in Iraq? You're asking exactly the right question. The answer involves some genuinely fascinating atmospheric science that would have sounded like pure magic to the ancient Mesopotamians. And honestly, it still sounds a little magical even when you understand the physics. Here's the basic mechanism. When a volcano erupts with sufficient force, it doesn't just spew lava and ash across the local landscape. The really powerful eruptions, the ones that make the geological record sit up and take notice, blast enormous quantities of material directly into the stratosphere, that layer of atmosphere that sits between about 10 and 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And once volcanic debris reaches the stratosphere, it doesn't just fall back down. It spreads out, forming a thin but persistent haze that can encircle the entire planet within a matter of weeks. The key players in this stratospheric haze are sulfur dioxide gases, which react with water vapor to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. These microscopic droplets are extraordinarily effective at reflecting incoming sunlight back into space before it can reach the Earth's surface. The result is a measurable cooling effect that can last for years after a major eruption. When Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted in 1991, an event many of you probably remember or have at least seen footage of, it injected about 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Global temperatures dropped by about 0.5 degrees Celsius for the following 2 years. That might not sound like much, but in climate terms it's significant. Now imagine an eruption several times larger, and you start to get a sense of what we might be dealing with. But cooling alone doesn't explain the drought. After all, if the whole world gets slightly colder, that doesn't necessarily mean certain regions stop getting rain. The connection to drought comes through the disruption of monsoon systems, and this is where things get really interesting. Monsoons are driven by temperature differences between land and ocean. During summer, land heats up faster than water, creating low-pressure zones that draw in moist ocean air, which then rises, cools, and dumps its moisture as rain. The whole system depends on a delicate balance of temperatures, and anything that disrupts that balance can throw the monsoons into chaos. When volcanic aerosols cool the northern hemisphere more than the southern hemisphere, which they tend to do for complicated atmospheric reasons, the temperature gradients that drive the monsoons can weaken dramatically. Less temperature contrast means weaker air circulation, which means less moisture being pulled inland, which means drought. The evidence for volcanic involvement in the 4.2 kiloyear event comes from an unlikely source: ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet. Just like the stalagmites in Oman and the sediments at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, these ice cores preserve a layered record of past conditions. Each year's snowfall gets compressed into a distinct band of ice, trapping tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere and any particles that happen to be floating in the air at the time. By drilling down through the ice sheet and analysing these layers, scientists can reconstruct atmospheric conditions going back hundreds of thousands of years. And in the layers corresponding to roughly 2200 BCE, researchers have found something intriguing: elevated levels of sulfate particles that are consistent with major volcanic activity somewhere in the world. The ice core signal isn't as dramatic as what we see for some other known eruptions. The layer from the massive Santorini explosion around 1600 BCE is much more obvious, for instance, but it's definitely there. The challenge is figuring out which volcano was responsible. Unlike more recent eruptions, where we can match ice core chemistry to specific volcanic sources, eruptions from 4,000 years ago are much harder to trace. The geological record from that period is incomplete, and many potentially responsible volcanoes have erupted multiple times since then, obscuring the evidence. Several candidates have been proposed, including volcanoes in Iceland, Indonesia, and South America, but no definitive identification has been made. We know something big exploded somewhere around 2200 BCE. We just don't know exactly what or where. One particularly intriguing candidate is a volcano in the Zagros Mountains of Iran. Yes, the same mountain range where the Gutians lived before sweeping down to ravage the Akkadian Empire. If a major eruption occurred in this region, it would have been much closer to Mesopotamia and might have had particularly severe local effects in addition to the global climate disruption. Some researchers have also pointed to volcanic activity in Anatolia, which would have been within the Akkadian sphere of influence. Imagine being a Mesopotamian farmer watching a distant mountain explode, not realizing that the ash cloud drifting across the sky was the opening act of a 3-century drought that would destroy everything you knew. Talk about not seeing the big picture. The volcanic hypothesis gains additional support from historical parallels. We know that major volcanic eruptions have disrupted human civilizations multiple times throughout history, and the patterns are remarkably consistent. The eruption of Tambora in Indonesia in 1815, the largest volcanic event in recorded history, caused the infamous Year Without a Summer in 1816. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Food prices skyrocketed. People starved. And that was from a single year of volcanic cooling. The 4.2 kiloyear event appears to have involved climate disruption lasting centuries. The Santorini eruption around 1600 BCE, which we mentioned earlier, is thought to have contributed to the decline of the Minoan civilization on Crete, another sophisticated Bronze Age culture brought low by volcanic violence. The pattern repeats throughout history. Volcano explodes, climate goes haywire, civilizations that had seemed invincible suddenly discover just how dependent they were on stable environmental conditions. There's also the possibility that the 4.2 kiloyear event wasn't triggered by a single volcanic eruption, but by a cluster of eruptions occurring over a relatively short period. Volcanic activity tends to be somewhat episodic, with periods of relative quiet interrupted by phases of increased activity across multiple volcanic systems. If several large eruptions occurred within a few decades of each other around 2200 BCE, their combined effects could have been far more severe than any single event. The stratospheric aerosol loading wouldn't have had time to clear before the next eruption added more material, creating a sustained cooling effect that persisted long enough to fundamentally reorganize global climate patterns. This scenario is harder to confirm from the geological record, but it would explain why the drought was so severe and so prolonged. Of course, the volcanic hypothesis isn't the only explanation on the table. Some researchers have pointed to changes in solar output, arguing that reduced solar activity could have cooled the climate enough to disrupt monsoon patterns. Others have suggested that the drought was caused by internal variability in the climate system, essentially a random fluctuation that happened to persist for an unusually long time. There are also theories involving changes in ocean circulation, shifts in the position of the intertropical convergence zone, and various other atmospheric phenomena that could have contributed to the disaster. The honest truth is that we don't know for certain what caused the 4.2 kilo-year event, and we may never know with complete confidence. Climate is a complex system with many interacting components, and events from 4,000 years ago are inherently difficult to investigate. But here's what makes the volcanic hypothesis so compelling. It provides a mechanism that connects multiple pieces of evidence into a coherent story. The ice core data shows volcanic activity around the right time. The monsoon disruption explains why the drought was so severe in regions that depend on seasonal rainfall. The global nature of the event, affecting not just Mesopotamia but Egypt, the Indus Valley and the Aegean, makes sense if the trigger was something that affected the entire planet's atmosphere. And the timing matches what we see in the archaeological record, with civilizations across multiple continents experiencing simultaneous collapse. No single piece of evidence proves the volcanic hypothesis, but taken together, they paint a picture that's remarkably consistent. There's something almost poetic about the idea that the world's first empire might have been destroyed by a volcano. Here was a civilization that had conquered everything in its path, that had built the most sophisticated administrative system the world had ever seen, that had accumulated wealth and power on an unprecedented scale, and it was all brought down by a mountain exploding somewhere on the other side of the planet, sending invisible particles into the sky that would take years to settle, while the rain stopped falling and the crops withered in the fields. The Akkadians had no way of understanding what was happening to them. They couldn't see the volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere or calculate the disruption to monsoon patterns. All they knew was that the gods had turned against them, that the natural order had been shattered, that the world they had known was ending, and in a way they were right. The gods hadn't cursed them, but something had changed in the fundamental workings of the world, something beyond human control, beyond human understanding, beyond anything their civilization was equipped to handle. When we look at ancient explanations involving divine punishment, we tend to feel a bit smug about how much more we understand than they did. But consider this. If a similar volcanic event occurred today, disrupting global climate patterns for 3 centuries, would our civilization survive? We have satellite monitoring and computer models and international scientific cooperation, but we also have 7 billion people depending on agricultural systems that are far more interconnected and far more fragile than anything the Akkadians could have imagined. The Akkadians' divine explanations might have been wrong about the mechanism, but they were absolutely right about the most important truth. Sometimes forces beyond human control can destroy everything you've built, no matter how powerful you think you are. But the volcanic aerosols and disrupted monsoons weren't the only threat facing the Akkadian Empire in its final days. As the drought tightened its grip on Mesopotamia, another danger was descending from the mountains, a human danger, desperate and hungry, with nothing left to lose. The Akkadians were coming, and they were about to become the instruments of what the ancient texts would call divine vengeance. The drought was strangling Mesopotamia, the harvests were failing, the granaries were emptying, and the once invincible Akkadian Empire was showing cracks that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. But environmental catastrophe alone didn't deliver the final blow. That honor went to a people whose very name would become synonymous with chaos and destruction in Mesopotamian memory, the Akkadians. If you've never heard of them, don't worry, most people haven't, which is actually kind of remarkable given how thoroughly they traumatized one of the world's most literate civilizations. The Sumerians and Akkadians wrote about the Akkadians the way horror movie screenwriters write about monsters, and honestly, the descriptions are so over the top that you almost have to admire the commitment to dramatic exaggeration. Or maybe it wasn't exaggeration at all. Maybe these mountain warriors really were that terrifying. The Akkadians came from the Zagros Mountains, that formidable range that forms the eastern border of the Mesopotamian lowlands and stretches from modern-day Turkey through Iraq and Iran. These mountains were, from the Mesopotamian perspective, essentially the edge of the civilized world. Beyond them lay territories that the sophisticated city dwellers of the plains considered barely worth thinking about. Cold, harsh, inhabited by peoples who didn't build proper cities, didn't maintain written records, and didn't worship the proper gods in the proper ways. The Sumerians had a whole vocabulary of contempt for mountain peoples, and the Gutians got the worst of it. Ancient texts described them as fanged serpents of the mountains, as scorpions, as creatures with human instincts but canine intelligence. One particularly colourful passage describes them as people who know no food, who know no houses, who know no cities. Basically the ancient equivalent of saying they were uncivilized savages who probably ate with their hands and didn't understand indoor plumbing. But here's where we need to pump the brakes a little on the Mesopotamian propaganda machine. The Gutians clearly weren't the mindless barbarians that Sumerian literature makes them out to be. They had their own society, their own culture, their own ways of organising themselves that simply didn't conform to Mesopotamian expectations. The mountain regions they inhabited required different survival strategies than the irrigated plains: pastoral herding rather than intensive agriculture, mobile communities rather than permanent cities, oral traditions rather than cuneiform libraries. To lowland eyes, this looked like primitivism. In reality, it was adaptation to a very different environment. The Gutians weren't stupid, they were just operating according to different rules. And when the opportunity arose to descend from their mountains and take what the weakened plains had to offer, they proved themselves more than capable of seizing it. The timing of the Gutian invasion is crucial to understanding what really happened. These mountain peoples didn't attack the Akkadian Empire at the height of its power. That would have been suicidal. They struck when the empire was already reeling from years of drought, when the agricultural surplus that funded armies and maintained fortifications had dried up along with the rain. The Gutians were opportunists, and pretty smart ones at that. They watched from their mountain heights as the great civilization below them withered, and when it became clear that the empire could no longer defend its borders effectively, they moved. Some historians have compared it to watching a lion take down a buffalo that's already been weakened by disease. Not exactly sporting, but definitely effective. But here's the really interesting question, the one that modern researchers have been grappling with. Were the Gutians actually invaders in the traditional sense, or were they something else entirely? Remember, the same drought that devastated Mesopotamia didn't stop at some arbitrary geographic boundary. The mountains weren't immune to climate change. If the monsoons that normally brought moisture to the region weakened, the highland pastures that Gutian herders depended on would have suffered too. Livestock would have died. Traditional grazing routes would have become unsustainable. Communities that had survived for generations in the mountains would have found themselves facing the same desperate choice that climate refugees throughout history have faced: stay and starve, or move to wherever the resources still exist. From this perspective, the Gutian invasion looks less like a coordinated military campaign and more like a massive, desperate migration of people fleeing environmental collapse. The mountain peoples weren't descending to conquer a wealthy empire. They were descending to survive, pushing into lowland areas because their highland homes could no longer support them. The violence that accompanied this movement wasn't necessarily motivated by imperial ambition. It was the inevitable result of starving people encountering other starving people competing for the same dwindling resources. When you're watching your children go hungry and there's a river valley with irrigation canals just a few days' march away, moral considerations about respecting other people's territorial integrity tend to take a back seat to basic survival instincts. This reinterpretation doesn't make the Gutian period any less chaotic or traumatic for Mesopotamian civilization. The cuneiform texts describe decades of disruption, with Gutian warlords controlling various parts of the former empire, trade routes collapsing, cities being sacked or simply abandoned. The famous Sumerian king list, an ancient document that tries to trace the succession of rulers from the beginning of time, includes a section on Gutian kings that's notably shorter and vaguer than the entries for proper Mesopotamian dynasties, as if the scribes could barely bring themselves to acknowledge these foreign rulers as legitimate. The Gutians ruled, or at least dominated, Mesopotamia for roughly a century depending on how you count, and the Sumerians never forgave them for it. Centuries later, Gutian was still being used as an insult, a way of calling someone an uncivilized brute. But regardless of whether we view the Gutians as invaders or refugees, and honestly the distinction probably didn't matter much to the Mesopotamians who had to deal with them, their arrival marks the definitive end of the Akkadian Empire. The last Akkadian kings were reduced to controlling smaller and smaller territories, their authority challenged on all sides, their resources insufficient to maintain the vast administrative apparatus their predecessors had created. The final ruler in the Akkadian line was probably Shuturul, whose reign was so insignificant that we barely know anything about it. The empire that Sargon had built, that Naram-Sin had expanded to its greatest extent, that had seemed like it might last forever, simply faded away, not with a dramatic final battle, but with a gradual dissolution into chaos, drought, and invasion. Now let's talk about what the dirt tells us, because this is where the story gets really tangible. Archaeologists have been digging in Mesopotamia for over a century and a half, and the sites they've excavated provide physical evidence that confirms, and sometimes complicates, what the ancient texts describe. The ruins of Tel Leilan, Tel Brak, and Tel Muzan in northern Mesopotamia have been particularly informative, and what they reveal is both fascinating and sobering. These weren't small villages, they were major urban centres during the Akkadian period, with populations in the thousands, sophisticated administrative structures, and all the trappings of Bronze Age civilization. And then, quite suddenly, they were abandoned. Tel Leilan, located in what is now northeastern Syria, provides some of the most dramatic evidence. This site has been excavated extensively since the 1970s, and the archaeological layers tell a clear story. During the Akkadian period, Tel Leilan was a thriving city, probably serving as a regional administrative centre. The excavations reveal well-built structures, evidence of active trade connections, and all the signs of a prosperous urban community. And then, right around 2200 BCE, everything changes. The occupation layers from this period show signs of abandonment so sudden that archaeologists found domestic items still in place, as if the inhabitants had simply walked away from their homes and never returned. Above these abandonment layers, there's something even more telling: meters of windblown sediment, fine dust and sand deposited over centuries when no one was living there to sweep it away. That windblown sediment is the fingerprint of desertification. When agricultural land is abandoned and vegetation dies off, there's nothing to hold the soil in place. Wind picks it up and deposits it elsewhere, creating layers of aeolian sediment that can bury entire sites over time. At Tel Leilan, these layers are thick enough to indicate that the region experienced severe desertification for roughly 3 centuries, which matches almost exactly with the drought evidence from the Gulf of Oman stalagmites and the Persian Gulf. Sediment cores. The archaeology and the climate science are telling the same story, using completely different types of evidence. That's the kind of convergence that makes scientists confident they're onto something real. Similar patterns appear at other sites across northern Mesopotamia. Tel Brak, one of the largest ancient cities in the region, shows evidence of dramatic population decline during the late Akkadian period. Tel Mozan, ancient Urkesh, reveals layers of destruction followed by reduced occupation. Across the board, the archaeological record shows a region in crisis: cities shrinking, populations dispersing, sophisticated administrative systems breaking down. The carefully maintained irrigation networks that had made intensive agriculture possible fell into disrepair, their channels filling with the same wind-blown sediment that was burying abandoned buildings. Without constant human maintenance, the artificial landscape that Mesopotamian civilization had created was reverting to desert. But here's what's particularly striking. The abandonment wasn't uniform across all of Mesopotamia. While the northern sites were being abandoned, there's evidence of increased settlement in the south, closer to the Persian Gulf. This suggests a massive internal migration, with populations fleeing the drought-stricken north and crowding into the southern regions where the rivers still provided some water. The city of Ur, for instance, seems to have grown during this period, even as cities further north were collapsing. People were literally running toward the water, clustering around the lower reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates, where irrigation was still possible even in reduced conditions. The archaeological evidence also reveals something about the social dynamics of collapse. At several sites, excavators have found evidence of defensive walls being hastily constructed or reinforced right before abandonment, suggesting that the inhabitants were afraid of attack. At other sites, there are clear destruction layers with evidence of burning, indicating violent ends rather than peaceful evacuations. The picture that emerges is one of cascading crisis: drought leading to food shortages leading to social breakdown leading to violence leading to abandonment. It's a pattern that archaeologists have seen repeated throughout history, whenever civilizations face environmental challenges they can't adapt to quickly enough. One particularly poignant find comes from the administrative archives discovered at various Akkadian period sites. These cuneiform tablets record the mundane business of empire, grain shipments, labour allocations, diplomatic correspondence, legal disputes. But in the tablets from the late Akkadian period, you can see the crisis creeping in around the edges. There are increasing references to grain shortages, to failed harvests, to supplies that didn't arrive as expected. There are records of emergency measures, of administrators scrambling to find resources that simply didn't exist anymore. Reading these tablets is like watching a slow-motion disaster unfold through the bureaucratic paperwork. Not dramatic, but deeply unsettling. These were real people trying to hold their world together as it fell apart around them, and their tablets preserve their struggles with an intimacy that later literary texts like the Curse of Akkad can't match. The physical evidence also helps us understand why Akkad itself has never been found. If the pattern of abandonment and desertification that we see at sites like Tel Leilan also affected the imperial capital, then Akkad might be buried under meters of wind-blown sediment, its ruins invisible to surface surveys. Alternatively, if subsequent civilizations used the abandoned city as a quarry for building materials, a common practice in the ancient world, there might be very little left to find. The curse said that Akkad would never be rebuilt, that it would become a place of desolation forever, and the archaeological absence of the site is eerily consistent with that ancient prophecy. Whether by divine decree or natural processes, the city really did vanish. What makes all of this evidence so compelling is how it transforms our understanding of the Akkadian collapse from mythology to history. The ancient texts gave us a story about divine punishment, about kings who angered the gods and brought destruction upon themselves and their people. For a long time, that was dismissed as religious propaganda, a cautionary tale invented by later generations to explain events they couldn't really understand. But the archaeological and climate evidence has revealed that the core of the story was true. There really was a catastrophic drought. The cities really were abandoned. The population really did collapse. The Gutians really did sweep down from the mountains. The ancient storytellers may have attributed all of this to supernatural causes, but they accurately preserved the memory of what happened. The Curse of Akkad isn't fiction. It's climate history wearing a religious costume, and that realization should give us pause. The Akkadians were sophisticated, intelligent people who had built one of the most impressive civilizations of their time. They had irrigation engineers, trained administrators, professional armies, extensive trade networks, and all the other tools that a complex society needs to function. And none of it was enough when the climate shifted faster than they could adapt. Their technology couldn't make rain fall. Their armies couldn't defeat a drought. Their gods couldn't reverse the desertification consuming their farmland. When the environment turned against them, all the achievements of their civilization became irrelevant. That's a sobering thought for any society, including our own. The Akkadian Empire's collapse would be dramatic enough if it were an isolated event. A single great civilization brought down by drought, invasion, and possibly divine displeasure, depending on your theological preferences. But here's what makes this story truly mind-bending. The Akkadians weren't alone. Around 2200 BCE, give or take a few decades, civilizations across the entire ancient world experienced simultaneous crises. Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Aegean, China, all of them show evidence of major disruption during the same period. This wasn't a local disaster, it was a global catastrophe. Something happened to the Earth's climate that sent shockwaves across multiple continents, toppling some societies entirely and fundamentally reshaping others. Scientists call it the 4.2 kilo-year event, and it's one of the most significant climate episodes in human history, yet most people have never heard of it. Time to fix that. Let's start with Egypt, because nothing says civilization in crisis quite like the collapse of a society that built the pyramids. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, the era of the great pharaohs, the Sphinx, the massive monuments that still dominate the landscape near Cairo, came to a dramatic end during what Egyptologists call the First Intermediate Period. For generations, scholars attributed this collapse to purely political factors: weak pharaohs, ambitious nobles, administrative breakdown. And sure, all of those things played a role. But the deeper you dig into the evidence, the more it becomes clear that something more fundamental was going wrong. Nile flood records from this period show dramatically reduced water levels. Agricultural production plummeted. Texts from the era describe famine conditions so severe that they shocked even the usually stoic Egyptian scribes. One famous inscription describes people eating their own children, probably exaggerated for dramatic effect, but indicative of just how bad things had gotten. The connection to the 4.2 kiloyear event becomes clear when you look at what drives the Nile's annual floods. Egypt's agriculture depended entirely on the predictable yearly flooding that deposited rich sediment across the valley. Those floods were fed by monsoon rains falling on the Ethiopian highlands, thousands of kilometers to the south. When the monsoons weakened, as they did during the 4.2 kiloyear event, the Nile floods became unreliable. Some years there was too little water, other years the timing was wrong. Either way, the agricultural system that had sustained one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations for nearly a millennium suddenly stopped working properly. The pyramids were built on the surplus of Egyptian agriculture, and when that surplus disappeared, so did the political system that had organized their construction. The pharaohs didn't lose the mandate of heaven because they angered the gods. They lost it because the rains stopped falling in Ethiopia. Not that this distinction would have mattered much to the people starving in the Nile Valley. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ancient world, the Indus Valley civilization was experiencing its own crisis. This was one of the great urban cultures of the Bronze Age, with sophisticated cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, featuring advanced drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and urban planning that wouldn't be matched again for millennia. At its peak, the Indus Valley civilization may have had a population of 5 million people, larger than Egypt or Mesopotamia at the same time, and then, starting around 2200 BCE, things started falling apart. The great cities shrank. Trade networks contracted. The standardized material culture that had unified the region began fragmenting into regional variants. Within a few centuries, the urban centres were largely abandoned, and the population had dispersed into smaller, more scattered settlements. For a long time, historians blamed the Indus collapse on invasion, specifically the arrival of Indo-European peoples from Central Asia, who supposedly conquered the indigenous population. This Aryan invasion theory has largely been abandoned by modern scholars, who now recognise that the evidence for violent conquest is basically non-existent. Instead, environmental factors appear to have played a much larger role. The Indus civilization depended on a complex water management system that utilised both the Indus River and the now-vanished Gagga-Hakra river system. Climate evidence suggests that the monsoons that fed these rivers weakened significantly around 2200 BCE, the same pattern we see in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Some researchers have argued that the Gagga-Hakra may have dried up entirely as glacier-fed tributaries changed course and monsoon rainfall declined. Without reliable water, the agricultural surplus that supported urban life became impossible to maintain. The great cities weren't conquered, they were abandoned because there wasn't enough water to sustain them anymore. The pattern repeats in the Aegean, where early Bronze Age cultures experienced significant disruption around the same time. Settlement patterns changed dramatically, with many sites being abandoned and population apparently declining. In Anatolia, the sophisticated urban centres of the early Bronze Age gave way to a period of reduced complexity and smaller settlements. Even in distant China, paleoclimate records show evidence of significant drought conditions during this period, possibly contributing to political and social changes recorded in later historical traditions. Everywhere you look in the ancient world around 2200 BCE, you find evidence of crisis, collapse, and transformation. The 4.2 kiloyear event wasn't picky about which civilizations it disrupted. It went after all of them simultaneously. What makes this global synchronicity so significant is what it tells us about the interconnectedness of human civilization and climate. These ancient societies had no direct contact with each other. An Egyptian farmer had no idea that people in the Indus Valley were experiencing the same drought conditions he was. Yet they were all vulnerable to the same global climate system, all dependent on monsoon patterns that could be disrupted by the same atmospheric changes, all subject to the same physical constraints that govern agriculture everywhere on Earth. The ancient world was more connected than its inhabitants realized, linked not by trade routes or diplomatic relations, but by the invisible threads of climate that bound every agricultural society to the same fundamental environmental conditions. When those conditions changed, civilizations fell, not one by one, but all at once, like dominoes triggered by the same invisible hand. The lessons this holds for our own civilization are, frankly, uncomfortable to contemplate. We like to think of ourselves as fundamentally different from the ancients, protected by our technology and our scientific understanding from the kinds of catastrophes that brought down empires 4,000 years ago. And in many ways, we are different. We have satellite monitoring of global climate systems. We have sophisticated computer models that can predict weather patterns weeks in advance. We have international scientific cooperation, global food distribution networks, and agricultural technologies that can compensate for many environmental challenges. We are not, in short, at the mercy of the climate in the same way the Akkadians were. Or are we? Consider this. Our global civilization is far more interconnected and interdependent than anything the ancient world could have imagined. A drought in one region can spike food prices worldwide. A volcanic eruption can disrupt air travel across continents. A pandemic can shut down economic activity around the globe within weeks. The same connectivity that makes our civilization so powerful also makes it vulnerable in ways the Akkadians never faced. When their empire collapsed, the effects were felt across Mesopotamia. When our systems fail, the effects are felt everywhere simultaneously. We've built a civilization of unprecedented complexity and capability, but we've also built one that may be uniquely fragile when faced with the kinds of global environmental disruptions that have occurred repeatedly throughout Earth's history. Climate scientists have been warning for decades that we are in the process of triggering exactly this kind of disruption. The carbon dioxide we're pumping into the atmosphere is changing global climate patterns in ways that are already measurable and accelerating. Sea levels are rising. Weather patterns are becoming more extreme. Agricultural regions that have been reliably productive for centuries are experiencing unprecedented droughts and floods. We're not facing the same specific threat the Akkadians faced. We're not going to run out of monsoon rain, but we're facing the same fundamental challenge, a climate system that's changing faster than our societies can easily adapt to. The Akkadians had no choice. The climate changed without any action on their part. We, on the other hand, are actively causing the changes that threaten us. Future historians, if there are any, might find this detail particularly ironic. But let's not end on pure doom and gloom, because the Akkadian story isn't just about destruction. It's also about legacy, resilience, and the ways that human achievements can outlast the civilizations that created them. The Akkadian Empire may have collapsed, but it left behind something extraordinary, a cultural and linguistic inheritance that would shape the Near East for millennia to come. Consider the Akkadian language. This Semitic tongue, related to later languages like Hebrew and Arabic, became the international language of diplomacy, trade and scholarship across the entire Near East. Long after the empire itself had crumbled into dust, Akkadian remained the lingua franca that connected peoples from Egypt to Persia. When the pharaohs of Egypt wanted to communicate with their counterparts in Babylon or Assyria, they wrote in Akkadian. When merchants conducted business across borders, they used Akkadian. When scribes recorded treaties, diplomatic correspondence and scholarly texts, Akkadian was their medium. This linguistic dominance lasted for nearly 2,000 years, from the fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BCE until the spread of Aramaic in the first millennium BCE. That's an astonishing legacy for an empire that existed for barely 2 centuries. The Akkadians also pioneered administrative innovations that would be copied by every subsequent empire in the region. The idea of installing loyal governors to administer conquered territories, of standardizing weights and measures to facilitate trade and taxation, of using written records to manage complex bureaucracies, all of these concepts were either invented or significantly refined by the Akkadians. When the Assyrians built their empire a millennium and a half later, they were essentially using an Akkadian blueprint. When the Persians created their vast administrative system, they were building on foundations the Akkadians had laid. Even the Romans, who probably never heard of Sargon of Akkad, were inheriting ideas that had first been implemented in Mesopotamia 4,000 years earlier. The Akkadians didn't just build an empire, they invented the concept of empire itself, and that concept has shaped human history ever since. Then there's the cultural legacy, the literature, the art, the religious ideas that the Akkadians contributed to Mesopotamian civilization. The victory stele of Naram Sin, despite being created by a king whose hubris supposedly brought divine wrath upon his people, is recognized as one of the masterpieces of ancient art. Akkadian literary compositions influenced later Babylonian and Assyrian literature, which in turn influenced the literary traditions of the entire Near East. Even the Bible may contain echoes of Akkadian literature. The flood story in Genesis bears striking similarities to earlier Mesopotamian flood narratives that circulated in Akkadian versions. The ideas and stories that emerged from the Akkadian period didn't die with the empire. They spread, evolved, and eventually found their way into the foundational texts of Western civilization. And perhaps most importantly, the Akkadians left behind a cautionary tale that resonated through Mesopotamian culture for millennia. The story of Naram Sin, the king who declared himself a god and was punished for his arrogance, became a central narrative in Mesopotamian political thought. Subsequent rulers went out of their way to demonstrate their piety and humility, to show that they had learned the lesson the Akkadians paid for so dearly. The Curse of Akkad wasn't just a story about the past, it was a living political document, a warning to every future king about the dangers of hubris and the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the divine. Whether the theological explanation was accurate or not, the moral message clearly resonated. Don't get too big for your sandals, or the universe will find a way to cut you down to size. So what's the final verdict on the Akkadian Empire? Were they cursed by the gods for their arrogance? Or were they simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when the climate decided to throw a 3-century tantrum? The honest answer is, probably a bit of both, depending on how metaphorically you want to interpret the concept of divine curses. Naram Sin really did push the boundaries of acceptable royal behaviour in ways that troubled his contemporaries. The empire really did face the kinds of internal tensions and external pressures that make civilizations vulnerable, and the climate really did shift in ways that made Mesopotamian agriculture extremely difficult to sustain. The curse wasn't supernatural, it was environmental, but the human factors that determined how the empire responded to that environmental challenge were very real, and they mattered. The Akkadians didn't have the scientific knowledge to understand what was happening to their climate. They couldn't analyse ice cores or sediment samples or isotope ratios. All they could do was watch their crops fail year after year, their cities empty, their civilization crumble, and try to make sense of it using the conceptual tools available to them. They decided the gods were angry, and while we might smile at the naivety of that explanation, we should remember that they weren't entirely wrong. Something larger than human agency was destroying their world. They just didn't have the vocabulary to describe it accurately. We have that vocabulary now. We understand climate systems and atmospheric chemistry, and the connections between volcanic eruptions and monsoon patterns. We can read the warning signs in ways the Akkadians never could. But understanding a threat and responding to it effectively are two very different things. The Akkadians couldn't have prevented their drought even if they'd understood its causes. The volcanic activity and atmospheric changes that triggered the 4.2 kiloyear event were completely beyond human control. We, on the other hand, are actively causing the climate changes that threaten our civilization, which means we theoretically have the power to stop them. Whether we actually will is a question that future historians, assuming there are any, will be debating for a very long time. The city of Akkad was never found. Its location remains one of archaeology's great mysteries, a blank spot on the map where the world's first imperial capital should be. Maybe it's buried under meters of windblown sediment, its ruins waiting for some future excavation to reveal them. Maybe it was so thoroughly destroyed that nothing recognizable remains. Or maybe, and this is the option the ancient Mesopotamians would have preferred, the gods really did erase it from existence as punishment for the sins of its kings. Whatever the truth, the absence of Akkad serves as a powerful symbol. Here was a city that was once the centre of the known world, the most magnificent metropolis of its age, a place that seemed destined to last forever. And now it's gone so completely that we can't even find its bones. That's the legacy of the cursed empire, a reminder that even the most powerful civilizations are fragile, that environmental change can destroy what human ambition has built, and that the gap between triumph and oblivion is often much smaller than we'd like to believe. The gods didn't curse Akkad, nature did. But in the end, does it really matter which? The result was the same: dust, silence, and a warning that echoes across 4,000 years to reach us today. Whether we're wise enough to listen is still very much an open question. Thanks for watching, everyone. If this journey through the world's first empire and its dramatic fall left you wanting more ancient mysteries and forgotten civilizations, make sure to smash that subscribe button and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and let me know, what ancient civilization do you think we should explore next? And if this video made you think differently about climate change and civilizational collapse, share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Until next time, stay curious and remember, the past isn't dead, it's not even past.